Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another webinar. My name is Kanevsky. I'm the founder of Pinnacle 21. If you're interested in joining our future webinars, please check us out on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, or Pinnacle blog. During the session, at any time if you have a question, you'll notice a button at the top left corner. Go ahead, ask us a question. We'll collect them, and towards the end of the webinar, we'll answer as many as we can. Those that we don't get to, we'll answer them and we'll post them on our blog after the webinar. This session will also be recorded, and the recording will be made available on our YouTube channel. Today, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Tom Guinter. He's our VP of Clinical Data Services. Tom is a veteran of the CDISC SDS team. He's been on the team for 15 years. He's a winner of the FDA Leveraging Collaboration Award. And he's been in our space for over 18 years. And today he'll be our presenter.
All right, thank you, Max, and welcome everyone. Thank you everyone for attending. Quick disclaimer to follow the typical FDA presentations to at DIA conferences to remind you that we're speaking on behalf of ourselves based upon our experience. We are not representatives of any regulatory agencies, CDISC or FUSE, while presenting here. Future webinars, watch for more every 2 to 3 months. The next, so this webinar for the Study Data Standardization Plan really identifies the beginning of the standardization process. The next webinar will be the bookend to that, or the end-to-end, the opposite end of that, which would be the validation rules and how they're expected to evolve. I'm going to touch on that a bit in a few later slides at the end of this session, but the next webinar would be completely about the evolution of the validation rules and how things will be getting a little more granular, that it won't be what you would call one-stop shopping. Some future potential topics, and these are just on the drawing board now. Perhaps an overview of the SDTM, the CDISC Study Data Tabulation Model, trial design model, how recommendations on how to define epic and perhaps element to facilitate the review. And you will find that everything we're talking about is facilitating review, not just getting a submission in and avoiding a refuse to file. And we'll talk about that a little later on. But we hope that all of you agree that the goals are to facilitate the review, get the most expeditious review that you can. Another future topic, some key domains, obviously demographics and disposition, also in the SDTM. Demographics is the starting point, disposition is the ending point for subjects, and then of course how exposure and exposure as collected might support those, how they work together and how they impact the review and reviewability. And lastly, at least lastly on the short list today of what we have planned for the future, discussion around baseline flags, whether they are appropriate in the SDTM or whether the newly proposed variable for last observation before first dose of the flag, whether it would be more appropriate to use that, less appropriate, et cetera. What would facilitate review? So those are some of the upcoming topics, so please watch our website for that. So today's discussion is on the Study Data Standardization Plan, but before we launch into that, we really need to back up and identify the FDA guidance, regulation and guidance driving the request for the Study Data Standardization Plan. Of course, the Technical Conformance Guide, where the binding guidance will refer to that, and this would be the Study Data Technical Conformance Guide. The FUSE organization has a sub-team that has proposed a template for submitting or for representing and recording the Study Data Standardization Plan. So it would be remiss if we didn't cover that. The FUSE team has done a lot of work on this and has a great template that's about to go out. We believe it's in the FDA's hands, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes as well. The Big Bang. This isn't the TV show. This isn't the beginning of time for for the universe, but the beginning of time, were perhaps the expansion of rules, standards, and the rules that apply to standards and how they interact, overlap, but that they are moving at their own pace and in their own direction. I already mentioned how the validation rules would apply to that. Then standards and upversion considerations. You'll find that the FUSE template, the FUSE guidance does discuss whether you should consider upversioning an existing study. Why would you do that and why wouldn't you? And then, of course, conclusions and questions. So to really establish the baseline here, for lack of a better word, the foundation would be the FDA's binding guidance, the guidance that requires that all studies starting on or after December 17th of this year would be required to be in the data standards. It references the FDA's data standards catalog, which identifies the versions of all of the standards that the FDA currently supports. The study data technical conformance guide. So these are non-binding recommendations, but at least in our experience, non-binding is an interesting word because although today the standards are not binding, many companies do submit in the standards, and many review divisions do openly ask for data and encourage, and perhaps encourage even is too soft of a word, the use of the standards. So while it's identified as non-binding, there are certainly things in there that you could argue are pretty strong recommendations. So we'll cover that quickly as well. I already mentioned the required implementation date, so December 17th this year for all studies. And I'll cover that on a few later slides as well. Historically, there have been some questions about whether phase 1 studies would be required to be in the standards, perhaps phase 0, or studies that don't include observational studies, that don't include study med. Well, what about your post-marketing commitments as well? To our knowledge, this is for all studies that would eventually be submitted to regulators. The binding guidance, of course, talks about all of the different standards that are represented on the data standards catalog, the study data, the study data tabulation model, the implementation guide for human clinical trials that we refer to as the SDTCG, SEND, the standard for exchange of non-clinical data, ATOM, the analysis data model, CT, controlled terminology, and of course the documentation for all of this in the define.xml. That's available on the FDA website. In the lower left is just the reference to the document name. In the binding guidance, it identifies that sponsors may request waivers, but the binding guidance says that it will not, the FDA will not authorize waivers for the use of standards, only perhaps for the versions of standards. And the binding guidance identifies that the time to ask for the waiver is at the time you submit the protocol to the FDA for review. Underneath the IND, the investigational new drug application and process, that you would submit your protocol for review. And the binding guidance requests for that. If you're going to ask for a waiver, that waiver is at the time of the protocol submission. Historically, I've been involved in more than a few discussions with FDA on versions, standards, and the most common thing that I would hear is when a company is requesting a waiver of standards, suggesting that the use of a previous version would be more consistent with what they've done for earlier studies. In my experience, the review divisions that I've worked with have said that that was not a compelling argument, and we do find that the binding guidance requests that use the most current version of the standards currently published through the data standards catalog. That presents unique issues by type of sponsor you are, whether you have a standards management group, how large of an organization you are, how invasive the standards are in all of your processes, it may not be as easy to the larger organizations to transition to a new standard immediately as the smaller organizations. So much of this would be dependent on the organization. Again, in the discussions I've had with the review divisions when suggesting consistency with prior versions, they felt that that was not compelling. But the ability to come up to speed and the time necessary to come up to speed on a new standard, that may have been a compelling argument. Again, that's just our experience. So the binding guidance mentions, of course, the study data standardization plan. It suggests we should use the established FDA sponsor meetings, that we should provide it no later than the end of phase 2 meeting. It mentions as early as the IND application, but primarily geared towards the preclinical studies at that point, at the end of the, at the IND application. We will see that the technical conformance guide suggests that the data standardization plan is submitted at the time of the IND. And clearly a recommendation in the binding guidance, and this is probably nothing new to anyone on the call, that the pre-NDA, pre-BLA meeting is really too late for FDA to have sufficient time to review and come back with comments that industry could incorporate in time. It's too late in the game. It also suggests that we can request a separate Type C meeting to specifically discuss any of the data standardization issues. Okay, the technical conformance guide, as I mentioned, also discusses the study data standardization plan, and this is where it says that we should include the plan in the IND, in the investigational new drug application. So at the point in time where you're only beginning to develop your clinical program, where your phase 1 studies will be starting, we're being asked to submit the plan at that point. Recommendation to industry is to, of course, be a little cautious, perhaps a little conservative at the time of the IND, and you'll see later on as we get to our later slides that we recommend that you try to pull all this together more formally at the time of the end of phase 2 meeting, where you're beginning to, more than beginning to, you're planning for your phase 3 studies. You believe you will have a marketing application. You would start thinking about your integrated summaries, your integrated summary of safety, your integrated summary of efficacy. But that, of course, whenever you start it, it should be updated in each of your subsequent communications. Technical conformance guide mentions the reviewer's guide and the request to disposition any known issues in the data that you're submitting in those reviewers' guides. It covers some general considerations for both SDTM and ATOM. And these general considerations we'll talk about on a few later slides as well. It also mentions therapeutic area standards, or therapeutic area user guides, TAUGs as we're going to call them. There are some 30 to 40 TAUGs in process right now. There are, I believe, 18 represented on the CDISC website. These are being developed through CFAST, the Coalition for Accelerating Standards and Therapies. But at this time, there are only 2 TAUGs identified in the technical conformance guide. And these TAUGs are really part of the Big Bang theory, or the Big Bang in practice that I mentioned. So there's unique issues being identified through these TAUGs, that they are ahead of the published standards for SDTM and ATOM. We'll get to that in a few more detail in some later slides. Of course, the technical conformance guide mentions control terminology, and control terminology is also on its own development path. It's not directly tied to any standards version. Control terminology can be extended. Extended may not be the best word. The control terminology can be updated many times in between the standards versions. And then, of course, the validation rules, both conformance and quality. The Technical Conformance Guide recommends that you validate using the most recently published validation rules, and that you explain any issues that are identified by those validation checks in the respective reviewer's guide. So that's a topic we'll cover in a little more detail a few slides later, but think about a study that you might have conducted 10 years ago, and you've run the version of the validation rules at the time, and you've documented those in a reviewer's guide. You would hope to put that on the shelf and not have to open it up or revisit it. But there's really strong and sound rationale that you should, at a minimum, rerun the validation rules, the most current version of those, shortly before your submission, and unlock your reviewer's guide and identify or explain any issues that have been identified in more recent validation rules. Why would you do that? Well, the FDA is going to use, and the Japanese PMDA, by the way, are both going to use the most current version of the validation rules. So if you don't run the most current version, then you may not be explaining things that are showing up in those validation rules. Granted, they may not have shown up 10 years ago, but the validation is another what we would call the standards that are part of the Big Bang. So they're moving forward, and as FDA and industry and CDISC and other bodies developing those rules, identify additional rules and checks, just because you didn't know about them 10 years ago doesn't mean that they aren't potentially issues that could affect the review. So best to run the latest version and unlock the reviewer's guide at a minimum to update any issues found by validation. And the last line of the Technical Conformance Guide, I think, really summarize what FDA is looking for, and hopefully what we are as well. And not to read this entirely, but the last portion of this, and the FDA such that is commonly understood by all parties. So we're trying to get to a point where the data, the semantics, the explanations are all commonly understood. And as I mentioned earlier, if you're here as a goal simply to avoid receiving a refuse to file, so when you file your marketing application that the FDA decides to accept it and not return it because it's not reviewable, if that is your bar, then much of what we're going to talk about today probably does not apply to you. But I would hope that everyone here would be in agreement that that's not your bar. Your bar is to provide a package that is the most reviewable and will expedite the review, hopefully allowing the reviewers to answer the questions without additional interaction or without stopping the clock on a review. All right, the study data standardization plan, what we're here for. I would be remiss if I did not explain where the FUSE sub-team is in developing a template and guidance. I am not part of that study team. I take no credit or responsibility for that. They've done a great job with it, so certainly want to refer you to the FUSE website, and you'll see at the bottom of the slide a link to the FUSE website where the study data standardization plan and all the associated documentation is. A little bit of explanation as to where they are with this. There's a template identified, a draft template. My understanding is that all of this documentation is currently with the FDA for their review and final comments, and it's expected to be published to industry in a Federal Register notice, an FR notice, for industry to provide review and comments. So those review and comments would be anything about it, whether or not you feel it's appropriate to submit a study data standardization plan, whether you feel it's appropriate at the IND, whether you feel it should only start at the end of phase 2, whether you feel it should have more granularity that we may discuss here, anything and everything. When that's published by the FDA, it's up to sponsors to review and provide their feedback. So I already mentioned that there's a template, an implementation guide, completion guidelines, and 2 example documents for both asthma and oncology. I already mentioned that the FDA has the documents for review and the FR notice. The FUSE implementation guide describes the sponsor benefits. I really can't add anything to this, so this is completely from the FUSE sub-team, that it would bring the focus and agreement throughout the project lifecycle on what the data standardization plan is and what the goals of them are. It would be the reference for all sponsor groups, both sponsor and FDA, means of tracking the discussions and the agreements that you would have with regulators on what versions of the standards you're going to use and what issues you have with those. And that it would also drive your decisions about whether or not you would convert any legacy data and up versioning to a later version, perhaps to allow for pooling of your data for the integrated summary. So I can't take any credit for these. You'll see they're quoted. They're directly from the FUSE documents, and I really don't have anything to add beyond that. Those are exactly what we would describe as the benefits. The standards that the FUSE documents would reference, of course, are the exchange standards, what we would be talking about here, the SDTM, ATOM, etc. It also documents that perhaps more than one exchange format may be listed. And that is really what we're going to get into with the Big Bang issue here, that the standards moving forward, the tags perhaps identifying provisional items that you may want to implement. You may find the SDTM versions are moving in a different path than the implementation guides associated with them. We're going to cover that briefly. That they suggest you would document your primary source. So if you are using SDTM IG 3.2, which is supported by SDTM 1.4, there are some things in some of the tags that are provisional beyond that that you may want to use. It suggests that you would identify your primary source, but also provides another section to discuss the differences, the additions, the things that aren't exactly in line with what your primary sources are. So, again, let me back up one slide. I take no credit for what FUSE has done. I'm simply relaying what is on their website. We are not part of their sub-team. Great documents. I would encourage you strongly, if you have not already, to take a look at the website on what the study data standardization plan is there. Okay, the Big Bang. Well, I really like this quote from Yogi Berra. In theory, there is no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is. So, in theory, it should be easy to document and apply all of the standards. In practice, it probably isn't. The standards, I would say, are exploding. Some are directly related, some overlap, some are convergent. And a note, from this slide forward, I'm mostly going to talk about the SDTM, the Study Data Tabulation Model, and the implementation guide for human clinical trials. Everything we talk about there is an analogy to other standards, such as ATOM, the analysis data model. But just for purpose of this, I wanted to focus on one standard, and certainly there are more issues involved. More is not a good way to describe it. There are unique issues involved with the SDTM, but it doesn't, again, just for purposes of these slides, we focus on one standard and consider that the issues we're discussing would apply to all of them. So currently, SDTM 1.4 supports Implementation Guide 3.2, but SDTM 1.5 is about to be published in a final, which would primarily support SEND, the standard for the exchange of non-clinical data, but not entirely. There are a few things in there that support some of the tags. SDTM 1.6 is expected later this summer, early fall, to support the pharmacogenomics associated document, I would call it. And then we believe SDTM 1.7 would be supporting the next version of the implementation guide 3.3. But you'll see that there are a few things in SDTM 1.5 that could be advantageous to even things that you're doing in implementation guide 3.2. You'll see that 1.6, of course, pharmacogenomics data uses a lot of the same domains, the same structures that are in the implementation guide. You'll see some of those could be leveraged in other places. And then eventually SDTM 1.7. CT is developed independently, and we've already mentioned that that could be developed on a path where there's new values available, and it may be advantageous to you to upgrade to a new CT package, but perhaps only for one or two of the terminologies and not the entire package. Associated documents, the TAUs, Therapeutic Area User Guide, associated persons, people who are but people who are affected by clinical trials but are not the subjects in the trial. That is a separate document, and it, of course, works with the SDTM and the implementation guide, the pharmacogenomics, and those are just a few examples. And many of these documents contain multiple standard recommendations. And what do I mean by that? So that perhaps CDASH, the Clinical Data Acquisition Standards Harmonization, and that's not a required standard to use, it's encouraged, and it's not required probably because it isn't a submitted standard to the FDA. You would submit the SDTM, your analysis data sets in ADAM, and many of the additional data according to some of the TAUs and the associated documents. May also contain some validation rules. Arguably the validation rules are in there, but if any of you are aware, there are separate teams within both the SDS, the Submission Data Standards, and the ADAM teams at CDIS that are developing the validation rules based upon the current standard, that the future, hopefully as the TAUs or any associated documents are produced or published, that they would have additional validation rules set up to specifically focus on the added components or changed components. They're identified as provisional. But what does provisional mean? Provisional could mean final, but it could mean that it could change. So what does provisional mean? It means it's the best, guess isn't the best word, it's the best recommendation based on current information of how to implement and how to represent the data in these different areas, the therapeutic areas, based on current information. So they're available, but they're in a different state. They're in a middle ground state. Today, anything, if there's a new domain published in a TAU, today if you were to use that in Implementation Guide 3.2, for example, it would be identified as a quote-unquote custom domain. And it would be validated as a custom domain. But it's not really custom. You're using a recommendation from the standards organization, but it's not quite available to us yet. So it's not really custom, but it's not standard. It's in a middle ground state. And our validation has to evolve to validate those against what the provisional documents suggest without identifying issues if they were considered custom. They won't necessarily be incorporated in the SDTM and an associated implementation guide at the same time, per what I said, represented on the previous slide about how we might be up to SDTM 1.7 at the time of implementation guide 3.3. Therapeutic area user guides. The FDA Study Data Technical Conformance Guide does already represent. It supports the dyslipidemia and chronic hepatitis C. And both of those do include at least a couple of new variables that are not available in the SDTM yet. So when using those variables, you might use those as supplemental qualifiers today, but you can't use them as variables in the actual standard domains until such time as you have the ability to reference a future SDTM. And those are going to be very important issues when we talk about the future validation rules. Additionally, there are about 30 or so tags in development at this time. There are already 16 others that are identified on the CDISC website. So through the CDISC website, these could be draft or final, which would be the provisional. They're in different states, but there are at least 16 more of them. And a few years ago, there was a phrase in the industry conferences of 55 and 5, so 55 therapeutic area standards in 5 years. I believe that's 57 or 58 and 7 now. It's changed a little bit. I don't know what the current statement is, but there are many therapeutic area user guides in draft and or final for provisional that we then have to see when the technical conformance guide references them, when they become available in formal SDTM implementation guide. And as mentioned earlier, this presentation is focused primarily on SDTM, but those tags do identify standards in ATOM, perhaps for publishing in the defined file, perhaps for how you use C-, and perhaps control terminology as well. Now, there are some things in the technical conformance guide that are not in direct alignment with published standards, and there's various reasons for that. Some are more prescriptive, such as the use of epoch or epoch, however you like to pronounce that, which would be the phase, period, or cycle that things occur within the study, and this is applied retrospectively to the data. You don't collect it, but based upon the dates of the data, you line it up. It's more prescriptive because this is really content. The CDISC standards identify how you represent what you have collected, but you decide what you're going to collect based upon regulation and science. The Study Data Technical Conformance Guide is regulators' guidance, non-binding in time. Much of it is a little stronger than that, on perhaps what the content can be, and only regulators can identify that. It's expected to be in sync with the standards, but history suggests otherwise, even for a couple of recent examples, such as the exposure as collected domain, which was introduced in Implementation Guide 3.2 as a means to help industry provide a better, more usable exposure domain. There was some concern that, in fact, EC might undermine the creation of a stronger EC. And as those things were resolved, the Technical Conformance Guide does now accept it. But the previous version, when Implementation Guide 3.2 was accepted, it was pointed out that you should not do EC. It was also pointed out that you should not do the details domain, and which is now accepted as well in the current version of the TCG. But in those examples, when it says to not do them, it doesn't say where you should put that data. So that leaves some of industry trying to determine the best place to put things if there are statements in the TCG that would disagree with some of the standards. And then child acceptance, as I already mentioned, with dyslipidemia and the chronic hepatitis C. So where does that put us with validation rules? Well, currently there is a CDISC rules sub-team for both the SDTM and the ATOM, separate teams. In the SDTM, that team has been looking at all of the Implementation Guide version 3.2 and SDTM 1.4 to try to explicitly draw out what all the implementation rules are, both from the or from the assumptions, from the domain assumptions, from any of the additional guidance or examples in there. The first formal version of that is not yet published. It's expected in late third quarter, early fourth quarter this year to be published. The Atom rules were published initially about a year to a year and a half ago, and are currently being reevaluated for a second version of that to be published. I believe, again, now I haven't spoken directly to the Atom team recently, I believe that target is again late third quarter, early fourth quarter this year, but not exactly positive. The SDTM implementation guide rules, there are currently business rules identified by both the FDA and the Japanese PMDA. As CDIS publishes their rules, those will be backed out of the business rules that are managed by those regulators. Of course, rules for how to document the standards and standards used, data submitted in define XML. Currently, by primary source, the validation rules today, I would say, we describe almost as one size fits all, that there are rules associated with perhaps implementation guide 3.2, and then perhaps control terminology is the entire package. But this is what's going to need to change based upon how the standards are expanding, thinking of them as the Big Bang. You're going to have to move to an a la carte version where you select different components of the standards that you're using, and those are brought together into a package that's used, the combined package. Why would that be? Well, many of the things we've talked about already, but SDTM 1.6, for example, may include variables that were for some of the tags, and it may be possible to use those variables in an implementation guide 3.2 submission if you have a need for those variables in other domains. A general observation class perspective allows you to use any variable in that general observation class in any domain within that general observation class. Now, that's not a definitive rule yet, but it is under discussion. At least the retrospective aspect of this is not definitive yet, but it is under discussion and likely to occur. CT may be updated independently, and right now you're requested that you don't extend control terminology, rather that you request CDIS and NCI, CDIS working with NCI, update the control terminology, and then you use that at that point in time. Well, that, of course, isn't always the most efficient way. You may need to extend it now, but by the time you're ready to validate, that terminology that you asked for may have been accepted and may already be in there. So that what you originally did by extending control terminology is no longer an extension. The technical conformance guide may be updated independently and may be retrospective, as it was for implementation guide 3.2 when it was initially published, where the version that accepted 3.2, as mentioned, did not accept EC or DD as domain, but then has been updated that now it does. So there's periods of time while the standards are stable, but that the technical conformance guide may have additional recommendations. And that example was based upon what you would accept in the standards, but we can't forget content, that those guides are the place where regulators can identify the content that they want. We've already talked about the TALs, how they might implement new variables that you could use as a non-standard or supplemental qualifier variable. A non-standard variable is a synonym for a supplemental qualifier. And that puts the standard in that middle ground state that it's defined, it's available, not available yet as a domain variable, but perhaps as a supplemental qualifier. So how the validation is going to have to evolve so that you don't get any issues around use of provisional components of tags in an appropriate way. Domains that are not standard, but they're not custom, again, it's that middle ground. And of course, FDA or PMDA business rules may be updated. FDA business rules are referenced in the technical conformance guide. And as I mentioned on an earlier slide, there's maybe a reason to run multiple validations. And it's a strong recommendation from us that you would always run multiple, well, not always. If it's the last of your studies that you're locking before submission, then those would use the most current. But any studies locked a year, 2, 3, 5 years ago, that it's advantageous for you to run the most current version of the validation so that you're sure you're identifying what the FDA is going to see when they run their version of validation, because they will run the most current, and both FDA and PMDA. Up-versioning. So certainly the FUSE documents discuss up-versioning. Many of you on this call may be sitting here saying, well, why would you ever consider up-versioning? And many companies have really a practice where they would not. Certainly that's understandable. In thinking about providing the most reviewable package, there may be advantages at times to consider it. We're not sitting here saying you should or shouldn't do it. We're only saying that you should at least consider it, and that the appropriate milestone, in our opinion, is the end of phase 2 milestone, where you've identified your phase 3 program, you've identified the standards that you've already used, you should know what your critical data is for your upcoming marketing applications, and that's plural, for your initial NDA or BLA, your supplemental submission, your 4-month safety updates, your final safety updates. If you anticipate post-marketing commitment, at the end of phase 2 meeting is really the time where you should have planned as best you can all of that and risk assess whether use of the standards that you've identified so far would facilitate the best review. And that's all we're suggesting. And it's that time for you to do a little bit of a retrospective, look at everything, understand what's new, are there validation updates. Certainly this could impact your ability to maintain your linear data flow that industry, both CDISC and FDA recommend, that you go from your source data to your SDTM data to your ATOM data and to your TFLs and analysis pulling from both SDTM and ATOM. Certainly it could impact that, and that could be a reason not to. But then your pooling expectation. It may be cost effective to upversion some of your earlier studies, if only the safety data, to get to a pooled data sets or representation that would facilitate your ISS. And lastly, of course, facilitating review. Hopefully everything that we're doing is with the goal, again, of not just getting past a possible refuse to file, but of getting to facilitating review. Now, we would, of course, say that you would not uprev a standard just because of additional validation rules, that the standard you've used would be perhaps uprevved for other business reasons, but that you, of course, can and should explain any issues in the appropriate reviewer's guide. So conclusion, the FDA binding guidance requires both standards adoption and standards communication via the study data standardization plan. That the many things evolve, the study data technical conformance guide evolves, and we have examples of that. The standards evolve. The validation must become a la carte because of the way in which standards are expanding and exploding. Another plug for the FUSE Study Data Standardization Plan. It's a great starting point. Please do take a look at that website. Our evolution a rules evolution, submission plan are all going to challenge us in the study data standardization plan to evolve more granular. Hopefully, however, this is all a positive trigger to facilitate decisions, communication, and hopefully all of a better review package. That concludes the presentation of the webinar, and I think I'll hand off to Max now to see if we've received any questions coming in.
Well, thank you, Tom. This was very educational. Thank you. I think a lot of people are wondering about the data standardization plan and what to expect. So thank you. This is very helpful. We did receive a lot of questions, so we'll go ahead. I'll just work off the list. Most of these are actually for you. There's a few actually for me.
Good.
I'll try to answer them as well. But let's start with the first one. The first one is a little long. So you suggested that we should look ahead at the different target documents, associated documents. Are these eventually going to be included in SDTM and SDTCG? And does FDA require us to use the most current version of the standards represented in the data standard catalog? So if the tags are not in the data standard, therefore shouldn't we just wait until those tags are included in the AG before we actually use them?
Yeah, and that's often an excellent question from senior management, folks that are not often close to the standards. You can certainly wait, for them to be incorporated in the SDTM, in the implementation guide, or recognized in the FDA technical conformance guide. But as I've mentioned a couple times, hopefully the goal is to facilitate review and provide the most reviewable package to the FDA. If this is the case, there may be advantage to looking at available standard sources, even provisional, to make the most informed decisions. If your goal is to simply avoid an RTF, then you can wait. But if your goal is to facilitate review, at least in my opinion, it's a good practice to be informed of everything that's available to you, and perhaps you can leverage those provisional standards to produce the most reviewable package.
Thank you. The next question is about something you said on the FDA binding guidance slide. You mentioned the word all studies. Can you elaborate what this means? How does it apply to phase 1, phase 0, or even phase 4?
Yeah, thanks. I actually asked this exact question of the FDA at a CDISC meeting about a year and a half ago of an FDA panel. And the answer was, quote, "The guidance does not distinguish between types of studies," unquote. Now, I don't have the exact words said after that, but it went on to explain that, therefore, yes, it applies to all phases of studies. And it was said that the technical conformance guide and binding guidance don't specify phases of studies or different types of studies for exactly that reason, that it's required for all studies with a first subject enrollment on or after December 17th this year.
The next question is, you mentioned the technical conformance guide requests the data standardization plan at the IND stage. What is your opinion why this is requested so early before the end of phase 2 meeting?
Yeah, and I've been having a running dialogue with colleagues for many years about when FDA would require standards to be used, and if they perhaps require us to submit study data at even an earlier point. At an FDA public meeting about, 7 or 8 years ago, a colleague of mine that was having this discussion with asked the FDA panel at that time if they were ever going to ask for study data to be submitted before a marketing application, so perhaps at the time of study completion. The official answer at that time was no. But in my opinion, the binding guidance, the Janus warehouse, FDA's commitment to receiving data from EHRs, employee health records, all is pointing to the idea that the FDA may eventually ask us for the study data before the time of the marketing application. We're required to use the standards. We've identified the versions in the data standardization plan, and the study is done. Why wouldn't they? And I guess I would finish with simply a challenge to the individual that asked the question, all of you. If you were the FDA or a regulator, and you eventually have a warehouse and mining tool that allows you to look at data across studies, projects, submissions, sponsors, and your mantra was to both protect and promote public health, wouldn't you be interested in having data for all studies that have ever been run, even if they never make it to a marketing application? So I would just challenge you to think about that.
The next question is kind of a follow-up to the first question. So your white paper cites that the sponsor must identify numerous other standards, including the tags. Considering that the tags sort of are not, is a guide, it's not a standard itself. It's not listed in the data standards catalog. With such a wide range of topics and situational examples covered by the tags, it would seem very challenging for a sponsor to cite the full adherence to any version within the data standardization plan. Can you provide any background or your thoughts or recommendations?
Yeah, and that's really where I believe the granularity of the definition of the standard and the granularity of the validation rules they both have to go to a more granular level. So I would think you would identify, I would hope we get to a version identification by domain. A version identification in the SDTM, of course, is the general observation classes. But we have a version identification by the controlled terminology item. And hopefully we get to a point where you're identifying a la carte which you've used. And a la carte doesn't mean the entire TAUG. It means the components of the TAUG that you've chosen to use.
The next question, just as to clarify. So are we allowed to use the tags as domains in an FDA submission?
Absolutely. If you collected data for a particular topic, you're expected to submit all data that you've collected according to the SDTM. And that's really the principle that in 2002 was brought to CDISC, that at the time CDISC was working on safety data standards. And FDA brought the principle in that while they were participating in the safety data standards, that they really wanted a standard for submitting all data. And that was the concept that became the SDTM. When a domain is published in an implementation guide, we call it quote-unquote standard. When you have data that's not for a standard domain, we call it quote-unquote custom. So you would be expected to submit this data anyway. You can create a custom domain, but why not look ahead at the provisional domains, and why not use that? There's advantage to doing that in that hopefully many of the issues are already pointed out in the TOM. So you're already required to submit the data, and why create a custom domain with a different domain code than the TAUGs have already produced? There's not really any advantage to that. The advantage would be to look ahead and use those TAUGs.
All right. Next question. So is the actual data standardization plan, is that mandatory for the submissions for INDs starting December?
In my opinion, that's slightly questionable whether it's mandatory at the IND. I say that only slightly because the binding guidance does request it at the IND, but in my opinion, the binding guidance really identifies that it's more for the preclinical. Mm-hmm. However, the technical conformance guide, which in theory is non-binding, but in practice is probably more than non-binding, does request it at the IND. So time will tell us as we go forward with our IND discussions, but both the binding guidance and the technical conformance guide both do reference it at the time of the IND, and the technical conformance guide references it for all standards, not just for your preclinical.
What are the expectations from PMDA regarding the data transition plan?
Max, I am going to have to ask you to answer your own that question on that. I don't know the answer to that.
I don't think I do either. We'll have to check back, and we'll provide an answer in our blog.
And that would be a good question to follow up with the FUSE working group, so we'll follow up there as well. That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that.
The next one is actually from me. What defines the most recent version of validation checks for FDA? Does this refer to the complete package of checks provided by Pinnacle, or is it a set of checks by a particular platform, combination of FDA validation rules and CDISC checks? So Pinnacle 21 offers different versions for different platforms, so which one basically should we use for submission? So the latest rules are what FDA and PMDA publishes on their website. So if you go to individual websites, you can see the list of the latest rules. The version that is made available by Pinnacle will always align to those rules. We have made that switch about a year ago. When you use Pinnacle Validator, you are basically using the FDA and PMDA version of the checks. We do not offer any other version. This is designed to assist you with submission. So if we have for example, right now we have release 2.11. When 2.12 comes out, actually might come out as early as this week or early next week. That's just a patch release. It doesn't introduce any new rules, but it does fix bugs in the existing rule implementations. So you do want to make sure that you stay on the latest patch release of an existing release because it addresses the bugs that have already been addressed at FDA. So you want to make sure that you see things the same exact way that the FDA is going to see. Another question that was related to this one was about particular sponsor, they were dropping their permissible variables that were empty, that had no data from their data sets based on the validation rule in Pinnacle Validator. And the question was, well, when I'm doing, this is a post-hoc processing step, what I do throughout the process, obviously I don't want to drop those variables during the process. So once again, the rules that are out there are meant to be for submission. We have absolutely no idea about the various stages in individual companies. So when you download the free tool, it's designed to be for submission. You can obviously customize the rules, so you can upgrade to the enterprise version that makes that a lot easier for you. But we do understand that we make it very clear that what's out there is specifically for submission.
And Max, just to add on to the dropping permissible variables, that's something under discussion within the CDISC SDS team now, perhaps updating the guidance to say, if you've identified it as a collected variable, today the metadata guidance says you should keep it on the annotated CRF, but you would drop it from the data and the define file, but document it in the study data reviewer's guide. There's a discussion now about changing that guidance to say, don't drop it from the data set, because FDA requests that you shorten all variables to the shortest length. So you might reshorten those to 0 or 1, and then you still have a place in the define file to document that no data was collected. So today you were expected to drop it. Well, expected is too strong of a word. You're allowed to. You are still allowed to keep it. And that's a place where, as the CDISC guidance evolves, that obviously we keep current with as the CDISC rules are updated, we'll keep current with the validation rules.
Exactly. As FDA clarifies, their expectations, the rules are get updated to reflect that. We'll just take one more question, and then we'll take the remaining questions, like I mentioned, and we'll provide the answers offline. The one question is also related to technical performance guide and what you do with explaining of issues. So should you only have to, is it sufficient to only explain the errors, or do you also have to explain the warnings and notices? Specifically, this question is actually specific for ADAM data, ADRG.
Okay. Well, I'm not an expert yet on the ADAM rules, so I'm going to talk about a couple of the SDTM rules and some of the notices or some of the warnings that are for adding a permissible variable and extending extensible control terminology. If you think about this from the reviewer perspective at the FDA, when they get a new package, probably the first thing they want to know is how is it different from the base package that they expect. So it's really nice to know that there's additional things done, but that doesn't make it an error. But it is still an issue that's identified, and that as it's identified, as far as we understand, FDA does expect you to explain each of the identified issues in the appropriate reviewer's guide.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit of background of how this came around. Initially, we actually had a mix of errors, warnings, and notices. Notices, for example, was for the labels that didn't match exactly, or for the extensible control terminology. However, both agencies decided to get rid of notices. Now you only have errors and warnings. And the reason was because people would just ignore notices. They would not explain them. They would just think that this is some kind of informational message. The purpose of the section in the technical performance and in the reviewer guide with explanations of issues, the purpose is to provide additional information to the reviewers that will help them interpret your data, why you have those issues that you have. So they're not designed to make you write more stuff. It's really designed to help. So if you're extending extensible control terminology, it's helpful to explain how you're extending it. So both agencies, the FDA actually requires you explain every single message that you have so every validation issue, whether it's a warning or an error, you have to explain each one. PMDA is slightly different. PMDA only requires you to explain the errors, not the warning. So there is a little bit of inconsistency. So make sure you read their technical performance guides. The individual agencies, they do provide that information in those guides. So that might change from time to time. Like Tom already mentioned, there's going to be a lot of changes coming up, later this year with the way the rules are managed and published. So additional changes could occur. So with this question, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. Thanks, Tom, for a very informational session. Once again, the slides, the video, and the Q&A will be published on our blog probably in about a week. So you can come back and look at the information, as well as the white paper that I'm sure some of you already read. And please follow us on our social media channels for future announcements, future webinars. Thanks, everyone.